Hey, greetings, everybody. How we doing? This is Joe Driscoll back with Salt City Grind. This is episode 7. Our guest today is State Senator Rachel May. How you doing, Senator?
I'm doing great. Good to see you, Joe.
Great to see you too. What have your days been consisting of? You taking care? You just swamped, absolutely swamped with everything going on?
There's a lot going on. I honestly, I think my staff is more swamped than I am because they're dealing with all the unemployment insurance issues, and that's just a round the clock thing. And
Right.
then when they run into a real problem, then I will make a call or, try to break the logjam, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot, just we've been having conference almost every day now, talking about how we can enact legislation that'll make a difference in all of the things that are going on right now. So
I know
that,
it was funny when Bob Andrews, who commented, said, "I think you guys might have a few topics to discuss." I mean, it's hard to know, hard to know which crisis to talk about first because there's so much going on, and so it's so overwhelming at all times. And I'm just really glad that I'm not, a state representative, because mostly I've had people reaching out to me saying, "How do I deal with this?" And I go, "Talk to your state representative. Here you go." And I pass the contact info for you state people. So, but yeah.
we pass it on to the federal people. Not really, but they're the ones we got to get the money from.
Yeah, exactly. I know that's the whole thing now. We're all just anxiously awaiting. And that's my whole thing with everything that's going on in Syracuse. So much is riding on response from our federal representatives right now. And, the response hasn't been robust. I don't know what you guys have been experiencing, but, Mitch McConnell telling everyone to go file for bankruptcy doesn't fill one with confidence, I would say. But, yeah. Yeah.
I think he's coming around. I think he's realizing it isn't just blue states that have the problem. And
we're going to need a national response.
Right. And it was embarrassing to him to be sort of saying, "Oh, New York, why don't you pay your own bills," when we're paying Kentucky's bills too, So,
absolutely.
And have been for years.
Yes. And not to the tune of a couple of $1,000s either. It's quite a sizable amount that we contribute to the federal pot. So I'm glad that came out. So for starters, how we usually do this is ask people on social media to throw us some questions. So we're going to tuck into some of that. But before we start, for folks who don't know you as well, tell everyone about your background, what your career was before politics, what inspired you to run for office, all those good things that, people are so curious about.
Okay, happy to do that. Yep, I came to politics very late and had several careers before this, but the longest one was I taught Russian language and literature, first in high school and then the college level. I taught out in Minnesota, and then I taught at, before that, at SUNY Stony Brook on Long Island. And then I moved here about 20 years ago, and I got a master's at SUNY ESF, and I started working at SU in environmental sustainability. So that was a long career too. And honestly, I had never thought of running for office before. I'm kind of an introvert. I had been involved in a lot of campaigns, but it never occurred to me to run. But people kept saying, because I was so frustrated with our state government and how we weren't able to stand up to the Trump administration. We weren't able to really make the changes that needed to be made here in New York State. I was so angry about that. People said, "Okay, well, then you run." And finally, I decided I would do that. So that's what happened. And here I am.
Yeah, I remember for me, it's kind of funny hearing you tell the story because I remember it all unfolding. Do you want to talk at all about, the IDC era is behind us, but on whichever topics you want to talk on about, the Democrats having the majority in the Senate now, and how the dynamics have changed. If you want to talk about that at all, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe in the context of some of the questions, it'll certainly be relevant to some of the issues I think your viewers want to hear about.
Cool. All right. So, what is your what do you feel like your first term in office has been like? What are some of the achievements and things that you're most proud of or most excited by? And what are some of the worst parts about being in office and some of the biggest obstacles you've come up against since you've been in office?
Okay, those are both great questions, and I could talk for an hour about both of them. But we had an amazing year last year. We came in the state Senate had essentially been controlled by Republicans for about 70 years with some very brief interludes. And so there was a huge backlog of legislation that had been passed pretty routinely in the assembly, but the state Senate just wouldn't ever bring it up. So we were able to pass a huge number of bills last year. It was historic. And I would say probably the most satisfying was starting off with election reform. So New York has had one of the worst election systems in the whole country. So bad that when North Carolina was sued under the Voting Rights Act, they said, well, we're not as bad as New York. Literally, I mean, we had some of the lowest voter participation rates. We made it harder for people to register, harder for people to vote, harder to get on the ballot. It was just really embarrassing. And we were able to change a lot of that very quickly. Some of those things require a constitutional amendment, and so it's going to take another session before we can actually make those changes, but we're in the process of making some really major changes. So that's been exciting. And we passed, it was like every week we passed another battery of important bills. We did reproductive rights, we did protecting LGBTQ folks. We passed the Child Victims Act. We passed, then in the budget last year, we passed criminal justice reform, which was really important too, and a very long time coming. And so, it was a historic year last year. The hard parts, this year has obviously been a completely different kind of year. And nobody expected it would be this crazy, but the budget is always hard, and it's hard. Is that feedback coming from me? Is there something I should do?
Oh, it's coming around on my end. Are you getting a lot of that major feedback? I think it might just be happening on your end. I think you're all right here.
Okay. So the thing about the budget in New York, the first thing everybody has to know is New York has a constitution that is different from the constitutions of every other state in terms of how much power it gives to the governor to make the budget. If you think about the federal government, the Congress writes the budget and the president can veto it, but the president doesn't get to decide what the budget is. But in New York State, the governor decides the budget, and the legislature by law has very little power to change that. And that is incredibly frustrating. A lot of the changes we wanted to make, like funding our schools better, are things that we're charged with. The Constitution says the legislature shall assure quality education for all children. That's not quite how it's a sound basic education for all New York children. So it's our responsibility, but we don't have the power to make the budget to carry that out. And that is incredibly frustrating. And everybody is just chafing at that. And that's not new, but I think it's newly important because now that we have Democrats running both chambers, we can actually pass a lot of things that could make a difference. But if we can't allocate the money, then it's really hard to carry through on some of those things. So the budget is by far the hardest thing. And then this year, because we started out with a $6 billion hole in the budget, and we're faced with the governor wanting to cut a lot of money from Medicaid in particular. And then we got to April 1st when the budget was due, and we were right in the middle of the huge flare-up of the coronavirus in New York State, and looking at another $13 billion or so of lost revenue. It was incredibly painful. And you know, I felt I had to vote for the budget because the budget keeps the schools open. It keeps the first responders paid. It keeps, sending money to the public hospitals and that sort of thing. And you can't shut it down. And the other thing is, if we vote the budget down, then the governor has even more power to make, to come back with a second budget. And at least we were able to negotiate some changes. So it's, the budget is just a miserable process. And my colleagues and I have a lot of proposals for changing that. It's going to be a long process to change it, though.
So that is something that the legislature is discussing at the moment, how to change the actual structure of how the state government is laid out and where the different roles of different government lies. That's something you guys are reviewing?
Absolutely, yeah. But again, it takes a constitutional amendment, and that's not easy to do. You have to pass it in 2 successive sessions, so 2 two-year sessions. So like if we pass it this year, we would have to wait until after the next elections to pass it again.
Okay, so the question that came up, obviously, 5 or 6 times. I always throw this out to social media, say, does anybody want us to discuss any topics that you think are relevant to local politics? And what's on everybody's mind is police. What's going on right now with the situation that just happened with George Floyd and everything that's going on. So the question was, will she write or sponsor bills to do the things that Cuomo listed? Can we set standards for use of force and define excessive force, reform Section 50A of the state civil rights law to release disciplinary records of officers accused of wrongdoing, and allow the Attorney General's office to permanently be tasked with investigating police misconduct? Let's get something done is the final part of that question. So there was a couple of pieces in there, a lot of stuff to chew on. So what's your thoughts about that question as a whole? Any parts you want to tackle? Any thoughts you have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I and my colleagues feel exactly the same way. And so we've been meeting this week. I don't think the leadership was planning on bringing us back this week. We were in session last week, but we have met twice already, and we're going to meet again tomorrow to try to come up with a package of bills that we can pass and that the Assembly will pass. It's always, you can pass things and make a symbolic statement, but in this case, we really need to pass things that can actually get signed into law. And so there's a lot of negotiation going on, but definitely either a repeal or a reform of 50A. We've talked about both. I'm in favor of repealing it, but it just is a matter of what they can get enough votes for. So 50A is the rule that gives law enforcement special exemptions from the FOIL Act. So you can't find out about what they've been investigated for, charged with, or disciplined for. And so we definitely want to change that. A number of other things we talked about today, which are great. There's one about weaponizing 9/11 calls. So we saw that Central Park issue where the woman called 911. Clearly just for a racial profiling kind of reason. And that happens all the time. And so making that an offense that people could be sued for or something like that is something that we want to do, so that people have to think twice before they just accuse, like that whole thing with Henry Louis Gates when he was going in his house and putting his keys in the lock of his own house, and somebody down the street called and said that the house was being broken into. Black Americans are subject to this kind of harassment all the time. We had a number of other things about an Office of Special Investigations and an Inspector General for law enforcement that would help with more independent oversight of law enforcement. and some things about excessive use of force, like chokeholds and or discharging a weapon, that there would be more oversight and more reporting of that. And then one that I think is really important, and it's kind of amazing that we don't do it already, which is the STAT Act, I think it's called, which is just requiring police departments to track demographics of who is getting arrested or, otherwise involved in the criminal justice system, so that we know where racial disparities exist and other kinds of disparities, if it's LGBTQ folks or other protected groups.
Yeah. Yeah, that is surprising to me that they don't already keep that data. It's surprising. I wasn't aware of that.
I think they have a lot of the data, but they don't have.
It's not publicly released. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's a great answer. So what do you think the likelihood of getting, you're talking with your colleagues in the state Senate. What do you think the likelihood of getting all these different initiatives through that you mentioned for reform with the police and what we're looking at?
I heard mostly support in my conference, and there are 40 of us. So if that's a very large majority that we have, if even 90% of us support a bill, we should be able to pass it. I don't know where they are in the assembly in terms of talking about these things, though.
Right. Okay. So I had a question from my friend Phil Pran with RISE. How can the state help to fund programs to build ramps for the hundreds of low-income families who need access to their homes and to avoid them moving into nursing homes? The state did not renew funding to home headquarters, leaving city residents who are tenants absolutely nowhere to turn for assistance. Are you familiar with what he's referencing there? Do you any comments about that?
Yeah, this is just one of many frustrations we had in the budget this year, things that were not refunded after last year. And also there was kind of a blanket refusal to fund anything new this year. So anything that wasn't funded in previous years didn't get funded this year. So yeah, this has been very frustrating. I would say to Phil, call my office, let's schedule a meeting. Let's talk about how we can work together to at least get this in the budget next year, and also to see if there's anything we can do in the meantime. I can't promise anything. We have very little wiggle room in terms of funding this year. But let me say, so before I took office, I was on the Board of Zoning Appeals for Syracuse, and I know that this is a big issue. Like, people are always in need of adapting and making homes accessible, and it's expensive, and it's a long process often, because sometimes you have to get these approvals, and so I really recognize what a burden that is on the individuals, and how government ought to be in the business of helping and not just putting up barriers to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this one comes from my friend Christina. Given that the governor is bringing up legalizing cannabis outside of the budget process, the MRTA and the CRTA do not do much to actually help Black and brown communities own a stake in the legalized industry. How will Senator May ensure that the governor's proposal to legalize cannabis actually helps Black and brown communities who are harmed by the war on drugs to own into the industry and not just work for the white corporations that take over?
Right. So we would like to be moving as fast as possible on legalizing marijuana, partly just for financial reasons, because it's crazy that New Yorkers are going to New Jersey and Connecticut to by marijuana, and they're getting all the taxes and we're not. But I think this has been one of the big sticking points, one of the reasons why we haven't been able to get a three-way agreement between the Senate and the Assembly and the governor to pass something yet. And it has to do with who's going to get the money. And it's a really, really important question. We don't just want this to turn into some kind of corporate grab. And we definitely want to make sure that the communities that have borne the brunt of the excessive policing in this area around marijuana, that they are in a position to actually benefit most from this change. So it's not easy. Liz Krueger, who is the senator from Manhattan, who has been leading the charge in the Senate for legalizing marijuana, she is probably the smartest person I know and the most dedicated to precisely this kind of issue. And so I trust her to be trying to do the right thing. And I share her frustration that it's been so hard to get a three-way agreement on it. But I think it may be that this movement now for racial justice that has picked up so much steam may help to move that needle. At the same time that our desperate need for more revenue in the state should be lighting a fire under people to move this along as well. So I'm hoping that combination of factors is going to help us get to the resolution that we need to get to.
Yeah, so excuse my my lack of awareness of it, but there's something that the Senate and the Assembly have already agreed on. Is that correct?
You know, I honestly don't know. This is one of the frustrations I have with our whole budget process, that we will be in the middle of negotiating, and they'll come to us and they'll say we're close to getting a three-way agreement, and then the next day they'll say, oh, sorry, marijuana is off the table. And even to us, it's pretty opaque what happened at that table where they were trying to make these decisions. So this is yet another thing. My colleague Jen Metzger has a bill to actually take all legislating out of the budget, so that when we're doing the budget, we're talking about the money, and when we are talking about policy, we're doing that separate from the budget, because you know what, the temptation is to throw a lot of things into the budget because we have to pass the budget, and throw a lot of things, good and bad, into the budget just so we don't have to debate them too much. And sometimes that makes it easier for lawmakers, to pass something, and you can say, well, yeah, I really was voting for the budget and that just got through, and you can sort of try to not take responsibility for it. But I don't think that's how lawmaking should be done. And so I don't know if we should get rid of all policy making, and marijuana is one, where it's inherently a budgetary issue as well. So it would be hard to peel it out and say, what piece of this do you pass in the budget and what piece of it do you pass as separate legislation? But for some things, separating them, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I know that's something for me is talking to someone who's unaware of the political hustle. Like, they're really frustrated when that's the situation. Like when people in legislatures are trying to get one effort through and it's tied to other efforts, and budgets are being held up because I think that's something that the average person, is usually very frustrated to read about or hear about. So I think it would be a good step to make, put everything in it, like you said, put everything in its separate box. So holds us as lawmakers accountable as well. Like you said, sometimes you say, well, I had to go with this because it was part of a package, and have to have each separate thing held up on its own merits, I think would be, a step in the right direction, really.
It would be harder and things would happen more slowly, but in some ways, yeah, there would be more accountability, I think.
Oh, if it happen more slowly, I might be opposed to it. Nothing can move any more slowly. I need
it would be, yeah. But I mean, last year, this was my first budget. Last year, we had gone around and around and around with the negotiations, and it was like 11:30 on the night when we had to pass the budget by midnight, and we had made all the compromises, said, okay, here it is, this is what we're going to vote for. And the governor, at that point, we totally depend on the governor to give what's called a message of necessity. If you haven't put the bill out there for 3 days, then you can't pass it unless the governor gives you permission to pass it. So we needed that from him, and we're waiting and waiting, waiting. And finally, he sends it along with a letter saying, I want a pay raise. And, we had to give him a pay raise because it was the only way that we could pass the budget. And it's just a stupid way to do business for the state. It just isn't how things should be done.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. So here's another one. Senator May has been promoting a new Works Progress administration to help train and build a workforce that could rebuild our state's infrastructures. I love this. Could she go into more detail on what type of work she hopes to accomplish in CNY? And this person has a particular love for rail and mass transit and parks, so they threw that in there. But yeah, what is care to elaborate on what your hopes are with this effort?
Yeah, sure. So this I'm doing together with Assemblywoman Pat Fahey, who represents Albany. And the idea is taken from the Great Depression, when so many people were out of work, and what the government did was invest in people to do the work that the country needed done. And so many amazing things came out of that, including a lot of the parks in Syracuse were built during the Works Project administration. If you go to Elmwood Park and you see all that beautiful stonework there, or probably, I don't know about Thornton Park, but a number of the parks that have spectacular stonework, that was done as part of the WPA. So the idea now is to put people to work doing things that we need as a country. And we have a huge backlog of infrastructure projects in particular, but a lot of other things too, like the contact tracing for the coronavirus is a very labor-intensive process, and it's something we really need to happen, because this is going to be with us for several years. Even if we find a vaccine, it's going to take a long time before we get to the other side of this, and having that workforce that can do that would be really important. Climate change and environmental resiliency are really important pieces of it too. So we're seeing this amazing change right now, where people are driving less, flying less. We're reducing our carbon emissions. But if we want to come out on the other side of the pandemic, building on that kind of progress in reducing climate emissions, we need things like weatherizing of homes, and all kinds of energy efficiency improvement processes. And we also, especially here in Central New York, we have, as the climate changes, our fresh water supplies are going to be considered an absolute treasure by people all around the world. There's going to be a lot of demand for them. And so we need to figure out the infrastructure, that we're saving water, conserving water, that we're dealing with flooding, that we're making sure that we are handling our water supply in the best possible way. So that's another area where there's a lot of potential for employing people to do really good work that will last for centuries, potentially, and really make a difference. I know that you're in the arts, Joe, and I am an amateur artist, but I feel like the arts are incredibly important to us. And I used to teach literature, so I understand the importance of the arts just in who we are as a society, and it's like why we are alive is to have culture and to interact with each other on that higher plane. And so the arts organizations are incredibly hard hit by the pandemic, and I think investing in the arts and in visual arts and building theaters and all kinds of things is something that we can do that would be a really positive outcome from this pandemic and bring us out on the other side stronger and more vibrant as a society than we even were before. And then finally, I guess talking about the food supply system, we've seen how supply chains could break, how fragile a lot of our food supply system was, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were relying on importing food from very far away and on and we weren't investing in our local food supply. And New York has incredible resources for agriculture, and we should be both investing in that and connecting it to the people who eat in the state, and so particularly to our cities, but to institutions of all kinds. So I think there are just 100 ways that we could do job development and have it be a win-win, employing people and making our lives better and making us more resilient and lasting for a very long time in terms of the effects the positive effects that it would have.
Oh, I certainly love the sound of that. That's definitely my kind of government. I love that kind of stuff. I would love to see, that emphasis of, I keep thinking there must be ways to incentivize when you're talking about local produce and local food chains. There must be a way to incentivize with all the love that's in the marketplace right now. I think of a place like a Pizza Regionale in Syracuse that has a big board on the wall that shows where every one of its ingredients comes from. We buy our, the honey from here and the cheeses from here. And it's such a consumer thing right now that consumers want to see that there has to be some way for government to step in and help support that effort and help support farmers. And it cuts down on, it's one of those win-win-wins in government where you're cutting down on the carbon emissions of the food traveling from across the world and everything. And I think that you're really tapping into something there that I hope you guys have a lot of success with advancing that.
Right. And you look at a pizza and it's fabulous, but it's also, kind of high end. And imagine that in a school cafeteria, if it's all over the walls, this is where the meat came from and this is where the bread was baked and all of that kind of thing. And the kids could really relate to that's where we want it to be, or even in hospital cafeterias or prisons, to people can really understand the system that they're inhabiting a little bit better and, feel connected.
Yeah, there was a great series in England. Jamie Oliver had a show where he went to school cafeterias across the country and showed children a chicken breast or a chicken drum and a chicken nugget and asked the kids which one they wanted. And of course, 98% of the kids wanted chicken nuggets. And so he took them on a tour to see how chicken nuggets were made and how they were formed. And by the end, every school, all the kids were like, we want drumsticks, we want breasts, and that's not exactly the same thing. But again, to show when something's, where's this imported from? Was this flown from here? What does this do? Teaching kids at that level there's a great book as well called Zero. And it was based on that Oscar Wilde quote, we know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. And it was a book I read about the analysis of food, that if you actually paid for the ecological damage that a Big Mac caused, it would be like $150 per Big Mac or something, because we're subsidizing the water. We're giving them, countries in Central America are giving them land at a ridiculously low cost, and they're damaging the waterways there, and they're damaging the, so that kind of thing of showing them, well, this, this is where the food comes from, et cetera, et cetera. It could be a real, real winner, I think, a real growing project that could help on so many levels,
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting things about my job is that even though we have a large Democratic majority in the Senate, there are 40 out of 63, I'm the only senator in the majority. I'm the only Democrat between Albany and Buffalo. So, and I chair the Commission on Rural Resources. And so I made it one of my jobs to teach my New York City colleagues about rural issues and about Central New York in general, about Syracuse. So I had this wonderful experience last fall where one of my colleagues came up here with her chief of staff, and we took a tour of the Brady Farm right in the middle of Syracuse. And the person giving us the tour reached down and plucked a little bit of asparagus that was growing out of the ground and handed it to this woman from this very urban woman who was walking around in high heels in the farm. And she looked at it like, what, you expect me to eat this? And she said, yeah, try it. It's going to be really sweet. And she put it in her mouth, and it was really like watching when the Grinch, his heart grew 3 sizes, like this huge smile. She had been so dubious about this whole proposition, and then this smile that broke out on her face was so beautiful to see, and she wanted to try everything else in the garden. And you have to teach people. They don't necessarily grow up knowing that. So that's been pretty fun.
Oh, that's great. So another question here: how could Syracuse area state reps work with those from other upstate cities to allow municipalities to pass residency requirements for their police forces? And it was funny, I just took I was just sitting with some neighbors right before I started this, and we were talking about this exact issue. And I think a lot of people don't know that, in New York State, it's state law that we are not allowed in cities like Syracuse, Buffalo, and Rochester to require our services, our police force, but also other trades to live in the city. So what's your thoughts about this legislation? How could we advance it? Are there conversations ongoing? And again, a lot of the reason why this legislation is placed is because of downstate of the situation with New York City. So any thoughts you have about some legislation like that, or how we work on that?
Right. Yeah. So that is one of the ways where I have to explain to my downstate colleagues, because I've raised this a few times and they've said, oh, well, we can't do that. It's too expensive to live in the city. And I'm like, that's not really the issue up here. It's that,
two different pieces. Yeah.
Yeah. And the last statistic I saw was from a few years ago, but only 8% of our police force actually live in the city of Syracuse. And you want them, you want public servants, but especially people who are going to be that whose interactions with the local population are going to be that important. You want them to be of the city, to be invested in the city, and you want them to look like the city residents too. So you want the kind of diversity that you would hope for, in the force as well as among teachers and a lot of other groups too. It's very hard to tell people where to live. People don't want to be told, and so that's the kind of legislation that is extremely difficult to move forward. But I do think we should be doing whatever we can to advance it. My understanding is that there was a negotiation with the union, the police union here, and it was a matter of, needing to pay very large bonuses to get people to move into the city, and the Common Council didn't want to go there because it was so expensive. So, it's also one of those chicken and egg problems. You want the city to be attractive enough to live in that people are going to want to live there anyway, and you don't have to force them to. And part of that is making sure our schools are the best that they can be, and part of that is getting past some of the racism that keeps us so segregated. There's a lot of different factors there.
Yeah.
I do think we should move toward that. I'm not sure legislation forcing it. You can certainly do legislation enabling it, allowing it. Legislation forcing it is very hard because you do risk so much resentment that it could make things worse. So you just have to be really careful.
Yeah, I know from the city's perspective, I think we'd be happy to take it on a case by case basis. As far as like not making it a statewide requirement, but just allowing us the ability to, require that ourselves if we wanted to. I think your analysis of the situation was right, that, it was something that we really wanted. And if we had more budget, it's something we would want to invest in to make happen. But I think it was just the price tag was too high, and we had to do what we could. There's another.
You can incentivize. You can say, you want to recruit more people who live in the city to be in the police force, and you want to incentivize the training and everything to people locally who want to live locally. I think you can figure out ways to do that.
Yeah. I agree, and I'm really a big fan of Chief Buckner, who's our new chief. And when he first came in, he was like, he gave his rationale about why he didn't want to force residency, and to your point, to develop some kind of program to incentivize to bring people in. I think that would be a win-win if we could figure it out. But it's a challenge with limited resources as well. You want to give people. Yeah. But then again, for me, a big untapped resource in Syracuse is our, our vacant properties and our land bank, and how we could, by trying to incentivize people. I'm sure there's some market, deal we could do where we're trying to entice people to move in. We have these vacant properties that, we could patch up, but some, we're working on it. It's as there's always so much to do, and so few resources and time to make everything you want to happen. But I think that should be a priority moving forward.
Yeah.
So I have a question here. Please ask the senator about her position on 3 proposed energy democratization bills, especially the proposal to transfer all investor-owned utilities in the state to public ownership as a tool for democratization, economic justice, and sustainability. Are you familiar with those initiatives? Do you know what that constituent is talking about?
No, I don't think I do. Energy democratization? Oh, so like municipal.
Yeah, I think he's talking about moving it away from, he says, supposed to transfer investor-owned utilities in the state to public ownership as a tool for democratization. So, that kind of concept. I imagine probably something like what Solvay has, right? Or
right.
But you could talk about, but we could talk about this in a broader context as well. You were also, a big advocate for the environmental efforts that went down this past year, and there's a lot of stuff going on with energy. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about. For me, a big one was the Vader, the pricing of renewable energy, and that seems like an easy fix to me. I think for me, what I've realized, and we just passed, the state had enabled PACE legislation, and it's something that legislation that I ran with and adopted in the city of Syracuse, and making renewable energy more competitive in the marketplace, so that when a developer is doing a $20 million project and they're looking at the long term as they're building this, to say, why would I think about going fossil fuel when the state has incentivized renewable to such an extent? But it seemed to me Vader was kind of a step in the opposite direction, making renewable that was already cheaper on the same footing with fossil fuels, and kind of rolling backwards in that nature. So what are your thoughts? First of all, talk about the initiatives you have undertaken this past year with climate, and right. What your thoughts are about what steps can we take next and some of that stuff.
Right. Yeah. So one of my proudest moments last year was when we passed the Climate Leadership and Community CLCP Protection Act. that then I got to go down to New York City, and Al Gore was there when the governor signed it, and it was a big deal. And it really was one of the most aggressive pieces of climate legislation in the country. And it's had a real impact when the governor decided not to allow the gas pipeline to be built recently, that he cited the CLCPA as the reason for that. And you know, he didn't have to do that. So that was pretty exciting that it is now changing our whole culture of how we think about energy down the road. But implementation is going to be the whole key to that. And I haven't heard anything recently about the climate council that was put together to implement that. I'm sure with the pandemic, everything is, all the timelines are thrown off now.
Yeah.
Some in a good way. I mean, we do have less climate emissions, but
it's
for the wrong reasons. In terms of other things that I've been working on, I have a few things about fracking. That, like, fracking waste is still trucked through New York State, and some of it has ended up in our landfills. And there's a rule forbidding designating it as hazardous waste, even though it's full of radioactive material and a lot of other things that you don't want in your landfills or your waterways. Literally, I have a bill to prevent using it in place of road salt, which is something that has been done. It's been used to just be spread on roads. So that and other bills about energy production. There are 1,200 or so actual wells producing, or that are at least permitted to be producing energy on state lands in New York State. And they don't undergo rigorous environmental review or anything like that. So I've got some legislation to make sure they do have to undergo environmental review, and that alternative energies, so renewable energies, have the same rights to be used on public lands as fossil fuel mining can be done. So there's a lot of room to make changes in all around the edges of the Climate and Community Protection Act.
Yeah,
I'll have to learn more about the democratization thing. The only thing that I thought of is that I have been working on municipal broadband issues and have a bill about that. And that's, not an energy utility, but we had a hearing last year about rural broadband, and there's a lot of New York State residents who don't have high-speed internet at a moment right now when it is more important than ever. And there was general agreement among Republicans and Democrats at that hearing that broadband internet ought to be regulated as a utility. It's almost as necessary as, electricity or water. So I think we're moving in that direction, and municipal broadband would be a great way to get there.
Yeah, I think that, you're absolutely right. And that's never been more stark and clear than it is right now. At the municipal level, talking to constituents where, all learning. I mean, luckily, Superintendent Alicea moved to utilizing television sets and stuff like that, which most homes, the bulk of homes have. But students have such an advantage right now if they have a laptop available in the house, if they have brought Wi-Fi in the house. And I absolutely agree with you. If we're going to be basing our educational system on being able to utilize these tools to learn, it does become as essential as water or heat or light to for the health of our society. People need to have it.
Right. And working remotely, you can only do it if you've got the connection. And telehealth is, we're moving to more and more. And even when the pandemic is in our rearview mirrors, we're still going to be there. I think I think that some of those shifts are going to stick, and because they're in a lot of ways better ways to do what we've been doing. You don't want to bring somebody who's vulnerable into a doctor's office if you can do the work remotely, because there's no telling what germs are in there, or how difficult it might be for that person to get there.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got to move on this, and it's been interesting in my district because I represent the urban core of Syracuse and I represent all of Madison County. The digital divide exists in both places. In Madison County, there are whole areas that don't have internet, or they have satellite. But there in Syracuse, there are there are a lot of people who lack internet as well. And it's less because there isn't the coverage and more because it's too expensive. But still, it's the digital divide. There are people who are being left out of the modern economy.
Yeah. So when I had Assemblywoman Hunter on, it was the first thought on everybody's brain, and I was just thinking about it as we were talking about it. I probably should have brought it up sooner, but you touched on it just briefly in a sentence or two. But the unemployment system, the flooding, and everything that's going on with COVID, with the unemployment system being flooded. Obviously your office has fielded a lot of, someone left a comment thanking your office. I believe they said Zach answered their call and got them connected into the unemployment system. Are you seeing the flood? Has the flood remained the same? Are you still getting the same stream and number of people trying to get on the system, or are we starting to see it mellow out and we're seeing more people connected into the system now?
I think it's been slowing. I know my staff is still working on that a lot, but I'm hearing from them more about things like people have rent and eviction issues. There's a number of other issues that are out there. Businesses that are trying to reopen and trying to understand the terms of reopening, that sort of thing. But unemployment, a lot of it was just because so many people flooded in at the same moment and the system couldn't handle it. A lot of it was because we had a pretty antiquated system for processing their claims, because we never had to process this many before. So I think it's a combination of not quite as many people applying now, because a lot of the people have already applied, and the system having caught up a little bit better to them. One of our biggest frustrations was that we kept hearing from the Department of Labor, have them call and we'll get back to them within 72 hours. And it wasn't happening. And when we finally said, okay, what's a realistic amount of time that they should wait? And they said, oh, it's really 10 to 14 days. And we're like, okay, that's frustrating and annoying. But we would rather tell them the truth than tell them a lie, because they're just going to be that much more anxious about it. And they're going to be calling you all the time, and they're going to be overwhelming your lines because they don't know. So, I think it's a combination of we're getting the real information now. There are more people at DOL able to process it. They've got the systems put together, and probably not as many people are needing to apply now as needed to a few weeks ago.
Right. Okay, so this one was from Bob Andrews. What does the senator think are tangible legislative changes that can be made to help us as a nation ahead in this great racial divide? It always seems we have lots of public protests, rioting, then inspiring speeches, words of change. But what are the action items? What are we going to do here in Syracuse, Onondaga County, New York State, in this nation for action items? Joe, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts too. How do we change the minds of this certain percentage of Americans that still want to believe that other races are not equal?
Whew, okay, well, let's solve that here in the next few minutes. Changing the minds, I don't think you can do that with legislation. That requires that we change our, how we live together. Yeah, our culture. but changing some of the barriers that make it so hard to change the culture is something we can do legislatively. I became very aware of it on the Board of Zoning Appeals, just how crazy our whole system of housing is and how hard it is for affordable housing to get built in a broader range of places. So right now, when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about a few neighborhoods in Syracuse where, we can add more units maybe, but we're not talking about spreading it over the whole region. So I feel like probably the biggest thing we have to do is figure out how to take a regional approach to things like housing and education and employment and transportation, so that there aren't the incentives that there are now to kind of freeze people out and keep people of color and people living in poverty kind of in their little enclaves, and make sure that it's easier to spread out. A lot of that is not probably state legislation, it's more local, and New York's home rule issues make it much harder for collaboration to go on. I think one of my proudest achievements in my brief time in office, it has to do with the STEAM school and getting actual money in the budget this year for the STEAM school, which was kind of shocking, honestly. But the reason I was so excited about the STEAM school and so dedicated to making that happen was because it is a regional school. It will be a regional school, and it will mean that kids from suburban districts will have a reason. It will be an exciting place for them to come and study with kids from Syracuse, and we won't have that kind of iron curtain that there has been around the city, shutting it off from the rest of the districts around it. And as soon as we start to break down those barriers and the kids get to know each other, and there's excitement about the arts programs and the science and technology programs, and there are parents from wherever, Fayetteville or Baldwinsville, coming in to go to the senior play or the musical or something together with families from the city. All of a sudden, that's when you start breaking those barriers down. And, it's a long process, but I think I would say housing is probably the number one thing, but also employment and transportation, and making sure that any government dollars that go into incentivizing new businesses or something like that are also predicated on making sure that the jobs are accessible, and that it's not just reinforcing the divisions that we already have.
Yeah. And Bob asked, my opinions on that. I would say many of the same things that you're saying, just fundamental things. I think a lot of ways you fix it is by just removing barriers and obstacles that prevent equity from happening already. A lot of the stuff around, when you're talking about housing and our code enforcement in the city, a lot of the things, and education. And it's really crazy for me. I don't know. Did you ever read Of Hope and Despair by Jerry Grant? I keep talking about that book, and it's kind of strange to me, because when consolidation came up, when the conversation about a regional government came up in Syracuse, I think it was just wildly rejected by pretty much unanimously in both the city and the county. Like nobody even. But also they wanted to leave out the conversation about education, which is the primary conversation that I think we should be having. When you talk about what North Carolina did, taking a strip of and Mayor Tom Young actually talked about this a lot when he was in office, about the pizza pie that I think many counties have done, taking a center point in the county and then cutting it like a pizza, where you don't have, just a circle where there's concentrated poverty and you put all the kids in concentrated poverty in one school and all the wealthy kids in another school. You get a healthy balance throughout the county of people from different economic and social backgrounds, which was my high school, Nottingham. That was, I attribute that 100% to most of the things I enjoy about life and enjoy about myself was growing up in an environment that was that way, was very diverse, very economically diverse, very racially diverse. So it's kind of crazy to me that we kind of keep having this conversation on this podcast now. With most of the guests I've had on, we get to this topic and it's kind of like we start talking about regional governments, and it's crazy that we had that conversation as I was coming into office, and I was someone who was wildly opposed to it and didn't even want to engage in the conversation in any way, shape, or form. But that was obviously before getting into politics. So I hope that's something that we can, I think the STEAM school, like you said, is a great thing that's putting our toe in the water, kind of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you just a personal story. My grandfather was very involved. He lived in Los Angeles, and he was a civil rights activist. And at the end, when he retired, he threw himself into the cause of desegregation in the Los Angeles school district. And I went out and lived with him with my grandparents for the summer when I was 13 and helped him make the first map that had ever been made of the racial breakdown of the schools in Los Angeles, which is a huge school district. And that was 50 years ago. And I think school segregation is worse now than it was then. And I think how much my grandfather spent years of his life just dedicated to this issue. And part of me is really glad he's not here now to see that.
Yeah, it's so much worse. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I don't know. I was at the Justice Center last night, and a group of women, including Nadicia Hernandez from my staff, were out there holding a vigil, and we spent 8 minutes of silence just memorializing George Floyd and the 8 minutes that he was being strangled by the police officer. And, I feel like this moment we're seeing white people and Black people showing up for these protests, because I think we're all understanding that we can't keep perpetuating a system where we're dehumanizing such a big part of our society. And I guess I'm hopeful that we're starting to look at each other differently and to think how important it is that we become one society. So,
Absolutely. And one of the comments was asking about that, about, the fact that so many representatives, so many elected officials are out there with the constituents at these rallies. And I think, you just kind of answered that question as well about, what do you make of that? And I think everybody's, from my own personal experience, the thing I keep thinking of is I helped organize the walkouts in my high school when I was a freshman around Rodney King, and that was, 30 years ago. It was, it's wild that we are, that in some ways it felt 5-10 years ago like we had made some progress, but it's always that thing for me that it's like a China shop, or it takes so much time to make all those details, or to build a house or to burn a house down. It takes you years and years to build a house and make a home, but it could take a few hours of fire to take it all to the ground. And it really feels, a real gut punch the way things have, relations have gone. But it's hard to say if any of that progress was real, that we're still, like you said, we thought we had made progress on this issue, on that issue, and here we are in 2020 looking and saying, how far have we moved on these things? And I really hope so. I guess my final, we try to keep these things about an hour. So I guess I'd ask you any final thoughts on, the COVID disaster teamed up with George Floyd. What are your feelings about, the future of the country, the future of New York State? Any final thoughts you have about the predicament we're in currently, and words for constituents or words that are resonating with you at the moment?
Well, so I feel like the last 3.5 years have been a real education for all of us in America, and an understanding that we all have to show up. And from the Women's March that happened the day after President Trump was inaugurated, to the many, many, many different protests and demonstrations that all the people who've run for office for the first time, I was in a class of, you and I, and so many others who have stepped forward who never thought that we would be doing this. I mean, I don't know if this was your dream forever, but
I have no intention of ever running for office, really.
Right. So, at the event last night, it was people organizing the vigil were my age or, middle-aged, and had, been thinking about this for a long time. But halfway through the vigil, the group that had been marching through the streets joined up with us. And that was largely very young people. And they were pumped up, and they were full of energy, and they were very positive about, keeping this going, really making sure that something comes of this. And I feel like I'm hopeful when I see how engaged people are now. And even though it's painful and it brings out the stuff that we don't want to talk about, or the stuff that is really, really hard, if we don't do that, if we don't have that catharsis, we're not going to get past this moment in our history when I think, the election of Donald Trump revealed a fragility in our system that was there partly because people weren't taking responsibility for our democracy. And I do feel that people are now. And so even though everything seems to be falling apart all around us, I have some faith in America right now that we are finding a new energy in us that is diverse, that is multi-generational, that is honest, and that is seeking justice. And I think we can get there.
That's it. Well, Senator, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me. And I'm really just trying to, it's kind of been, taking those silver linings that have come from COVID and everything that has happened. I kind of thought about how you really tried to use social media as a political tool. The fact that we can't go out and go to public meetings and meet with people and chat, all that stuff kind of inspired me to try to do something with this. And I've really just been getting great feedback from people saying it's so great to see so many of our elected leaders willing to be accessible and sit and talk. And I think that's always the case, but maybe, this has given us an excuse to, kind of introduce that concept to all of our constituents to say, we're here, we're with you. I know you knocked thousands and thousands of doors when you ran, but also with social media, letting people know that, we're out here and that, you can reach out to our offices and talk to us and present us your ideas, and, we'll do what we can to help, So I appreciate you being always accessible and being there for your constituents.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate you too. And this is really fun. So keep it up.
Let's do it again. Let's do it again soon. Okay. When you have some other great news to report.
Okay.
All right, Senator. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.